Picture this. A couple sits in a dimly lit ultrasound room, listening to the rhythmic thump of a tiny heartbeat. Outside the window, orange smoke from distant wildfires filters the afternoon sun into an apocalyptic haze. The technician smiles and points to the screen. "Congratulations," she says. But in the parking lot afterward, they sit in silence, staring at the grainy image. One whispers the question that haunts the generation: is this selfish or necessary? Across the world, another scene unfolds. A parent cradles a newborn on a rooftop, wrapped in a space blanket as floodwaters surge through the streets below. A neighbor, helping evacuate, stops and asks with genuine bewilderment, "Why bring a child into this?" These aren't hypothetical dilemmas. They're the lived reality of prospective parents in the 21st century, caught between two competing emergencies that ring like alarm bells in the night. The first, a climate crisis that grows more undeniable by the year. The second, demographic decline that threatens the very fabric of civilization as birth rates plummet across the developed world. Here lies the paradox that defines our age. New lives can become the engineers, artists, scientists, and voters who solve the crisis. The minds that crack fusion, design carbon-eating machines, or forge the policies that save us all. But they can also become the emitters who intensify it, the consumers whose very existence adds to the mounting pressure on an already strained planet. Is procreation in the Anthropocene an ethical injury, a cruel imposition of suffering on the innocent? Is it an act of defiant hope, a vote of confidence in humanity's ability to transcend its limitations? Or is it simply a responsibility that changes shape under climate risk, demanding new kinds of wisdom we haven't yet learned to practice? The culture is already wrestling with these questions, often in the starkest terms. In 2019, a movement called birth strike emerged, where would-be parents publicly abstained from reproduction in response to climate breakdown. Online communities like r/antinatalism and Child Free for the Climate narratives spread viral essays asking whether having children is fundamentally immoral. Surveys reveal that climate anxiety is genuinely influencing reproductive intentions, particularly among young, educated adults who feel the weight of the future most acutely. But this isn't a story about climate denial or environmental extremism. It's about the profound moral mathematics of existence itself, calculations that have troubled the human mind long before we ever heard of carbon dioxide or melting ice sheets. To understand why this question feels so impossible to answer, we need to travel back through history, into the depths of human psychology, and finally into the battlefields of the present moment. We won't prescribe answers, but we will clarify the question. Because in a world where the future itself has become uncertain, the choice to create or not create life has never carried more weight.
The doubt about whether life is worth creating runs deeper than climate science. It's older than industrialization, older than the very concept of environmental crisis. It whispers to us from ancient Greek tragedies, where Sophocles wrote that not to be born is best. It echoes in Ecclesiastes 4:3, which speaks hauntingly of those who have not yet been, as more fortunate than the living. In Buddhist philosophy, the concept of dukkha suggests that existence itself is pervaded by unsatisfactoriness, that life, by its very nature, involves suffering that transcends any temporary pleasures. Renunciates in this tradition often forego procreation, not out of selfishness, but from compassion, to end the cycles of suffering that consciousness inevitably entails. But it was the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer who gave antinatalism its most systematic expression in the modern West. For Schopenhauer, life was nothing more than an oscillation between pain and boredom, driven by a blind, irrational will that compels us toward desires we can never permanently satisfy. Procreation, in this view, perpetuates the cosmic joke by creating new consciousnesses condemned to the same futile struggles. Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher, took this pessimism even further, describing birth itself as a catastrophe imposed on the innocent. "The fact that life has no meaning is a reason to live," he wrote with characteristic darkness. "Moreover, the only one." For Cioran, the radical mercy lay not in living well, but in choosing not to impose existence on others. Contemporary philosopher David Benatar formalized these intuitions in his controversial book, Better Never to Have Been. Benatar's asymmetry argument runs like this: the presence of pain is bad, and the absence of pain is good. The presence of pleasure is good. But here's the crucial point: the absence of pleasure is not bad for someone who doesn't exist. This creates an asymmetry that always favors non-existence over existence, because non-existence avoids all harms while losing nothing that matters. But Benatar's argument goes deeper than pleasure and pain. It touches on consent and risk. No one can consent to being born. It's the one decision made entirely without the permission of the person most affected. Creating life imposes non-trivial risks of severe pain, disability, trauma, and death on someone who had no say in the matter. From this perspective, procreation is always a gamble played with someone else's chips. Environmental antinatalism builds on these foundations, but adds its own distinct thread. Thomas Malthus, writing in 1798, expressed early anxiety about population outpacing resources. Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb in 1968 and the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth in 1972 brought apocalyptic warnings about overpopulation to mainstream consciousness, though subsequent critiques showed these predictions were often overstated or methodologically flawed. The Anthropocene shift changes the calculation entirely. It's no longer just about raw population numbers, but about the kaya identity, the equation showing that emissions equals population times affluence times energy intensity times carbon intensity. Each variable matters, but in a high-consumption society, each additional person represents a significant carbon legacy extending decades into the future. But to understand why this question torments us so deeply, we need to examine the philosophical framework underneath: population ethics. Derek Parfit's famous repugnant conclusion shows how total utilitarian thinking can lead to counterintuitive outcomes, suggesting that a world with billions of people living barely worth living could be better than a world with millions living wonderful lives. The field splits between person-affecting views, which hold that actions can only be good or bad for actual persons, and impersonal views that weigh total welfare across all possible beings. This creates the non-identity problem. Actions that affect which future persons exist, like choosing to have children or not, can still be morally wrong even if those persons' lives turn out to be worth living. Meanwhile, the concept of procreative beneficence, developed by Julian Savulescu, suggests that if we do choose to reproduce, we ought to select for the best possible life, whether through genetic screening, embryo selection, or optimal developmental conditions.
It's a contrasting procreative ethics that accepts reproduction while demanding excellence. Against this philosophical backdrop stands the weight of tradition. Religious imperatives to be fruitful and multiply have shaped societies for millennia. States have long practiced pronatalism, using wars, welfare systems, and nation-building projects to encourage reproduction. Modern examples include tax incentives, parental leave policies, and baby bonuses designed to boost birth rates. But this history carries a dark edge that serves as a warning. Eugenics programs, forced sterilizations, China's one-child policy, India's coercive 1970s sterilization campaigns, all remind us of what happens when moral reasoning about reproduction becomes policy, particularly when it targets marginalized communities. The revelation is this: climate antinatalism isn't just about emissions or environmental destruction. It's the convergence of ancient skepticism about the value of existence with modern knowledge of systemic, planetary-scale risk. It forces us to confront questions that philosophy has grappled with for thousands of years, but now with stakes that feel genuinely unprecedented. The question isn't whether life involves suffering. That much is certain. The question is whether the particular kinds and scales of suffering that climate change might bring represent a qualitatively different moral calculation. And to answer that, we need to understand not just the arguments, but why our minds find them so difficult to resolve.
Why does this question feel impossible? Why do intelligent, compassionate people find themselves paralyzed between equally compelling moral intuitions? The answer lies in the architecture of human psychology, the cognitive biases and emotional frameworks that evolved to handle immediate, local problems, not planetary-scale ethical dilemmas involving people who don't yet exist. Start with availability and salience. Our brains judge probability by how easily we can recall examples, and climate change provides vivid, visceral imagery that inflates our sense of catastrophic risk. Wildfire skies that turn day into night, subway systems flooded in minutes, heat domes that kill hundreds. These dramatic events stick in memory and shape our intuitions about the future. Yet, the chronic, statistical harms of climate change, gradually declining crop yields, ocean acidification, marine heat waves, feel abstract and distant, weakening our capacity for long-term planning. This creates a perceptual paradox. We simultaneously overestimate the probability of dramatic climate disasters while underestimating their cumulative impact over time. The result? Decision-making that swings between panic and complacency, often within the same conversation about whether to have children. Then there's omission bias, our tendency to judge harmful inactions as less morally problematic than harmful actions. Not having a child feels morally safer than having one who might suffer, even if the statistical risks are identical. This bias is amplified by moral luck and attribution errors. We judge outcomes after the fact, retrofitting our moral evaluations to match results. If a child thrives despite climate challenges, we label the parents courageous or optimistic. If they struggle, we might view the decision to procreate as reckless or selfish. Temporal discounting compounds the problem. Humans naturally undervalue distant harms, but climate damages compound beyond our intuitive time horizons. The child born today will live through 8
decades of accelerating environmental change. But our emotional systems are calibrated for immediate threats and rewards. We can understand intellectually that 2050 or 2100 matter enormously, but we can't feel their importance with the same intensity we feel today's concerns. Moreover, we're not dealing with simple risk, but with deep uncertainty. We don't know the full distribution of possible outcomes for the late 21st century. Climate models provide ranges, but the interactions between physical systems, technological development, social adaptation, and political responses create cascading uncertainties that are genuinely unknowable. This creates precautionary reasoning emotionally attractive, better safe than sorry. But it also makes optimistic scenarios feel irresponsibly naive.
Working against these forces is the profound psychological counterweight of parental optimism. Parents consistently rate their children's lives as more positive than their children rate them. Eudaimonic well-being, the sense of meaning and purpose that comes from caregiving, creates powerful psychological incentives for reproduction. Once a child exists, the moral frame shifts entirely from abstract risk calculation to concrete duty. This irreversibility asymmetry makes the ethics of procreation fundamentally different from other risk decisions. Evolutionary psychology adds another layer. We are the descendants of successful reproducers, carrying genes that bias us toward kin continuation and legacy creation. The baby schema, those features that make infants universally adorable, hijacks our decision-making systems in ways that pure rational analysis can't override. Terror management theory suggests that procreation and long-term projects serve as buffers against mortality salience, which climate doom narratives heighten considerably. Cultural scripts further complicate the picture. In many societies, family formation represents life's primary meaning and adult identity. The heroic parent who chooses hope becomes a cultural archetype. But so does the heroic renunciate who breaks the cycle through antinatalist virtue. Both narratives provide identity and meaning, making the choice as much about who we want to be as what we think is right. The deepest psychological challenge is what philosophers call the impossible comparison problem. You cannot meaningfully ask a non-existent person for consent. Comparing existence versus non-existence is both morally and emotionally ill-posed, because one side of the comparison literally isn't there to evaluate the trade-off. Benatar's base symmetry argument provides a kind of cognitive stable solution to this paradox, but it remains emotionally unsatisfying for people drawn to life-affirming values. When facing this uncertainty, different moral decision rules point in different directions. Maximin thinking, minimizing the worst-case outcome, favors abstention when severe risks are possible. Satisficing approaches suggest having children only if certain capability and resilience benchmarks can be met. Moral uncertainty frameworks, acknowledging that we don't know which ethical theory is correct, suggest diversifying our moral portfolios, perhaps having fewer children while investing more heavily in public goods that benefit all future people. The emotional geometry of regret makes everything worse. There are two irreconcilable regrets: the regret of having a child who suffers, and the regret of not having a child you would have loved. Unlike most decisions, this one forecloses its alternative permanently. The biological clocks and finite fertility windows create a now or never pressure that amplifies every uncertainty. But here's the crucial insight. Our minds don't just evaluate the world, they help create it. The world we're birthing into depends fundamentally on the policies we choose, the technologies we develop, and the social norms we establish. The psychological mechanisms that make this decision feel impossible are the same ones that shape how we respond to climate change itself. This points toward a different kind of question. Instead of asking whether the world is fit for children, we might ask, how do we make it fit? And that question can only be answered by examining the concrete realities of the present moment. The intersection of climate science, demographic trends, technological possibilities, and political choices that define the actual landscape where these ethical dilemmas play out.
The abstractions crash into reality with the weight of concrete numbers, lived experiences, and political battlegrounds. This is where the moral philosophy meets the material world, where carbon budgets intersect with baby formulas, where demographic anxiety meets climate policy, where online movements shape offline decisions about the most intimate aspects of human existence. Let's start with where the climate actually stands. Global average temperatures have risen roughly 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events are increasing measurably. Current policy trajectories, even with recent climate commitments, point towards significant end-century warming without dramatically accelerated decarbonization efforts. But the future remains genuinely uncertain, depending on choices made in the next crucial decades. Crucially, climate impacts are distributed unequally. The poorest communities and global south populations face the gravest risks despite contributing least to historical emissions. This raises immediate questions about who has the moral standing to make reproductive choices based on climate concerns, and whether such concerns might inadvertently reinforce existing inequalities. The emissions arithmetic of procreation has spawned a contentious literature. Studies by researchers like Paul Murtaugh and Michael Schlacks, later popularized by Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas, argue that having one fewer child represents one of the highest impact personal climate decisions, especially in high-income contexts. The logic is straightforward. A child born in a wealthy country will likely consume resources and emit carbon throughout their lifetime, and their children will do the same, creating a carbon legacy extending centuries into the future. But these calculations rest on contested assumptions. They typically assume current energy mixes and consumption patterns will persist unchanged over decades. They don't account for the possibility of rapid decarbonization, breakthrough technologies, or fundamental shifts in how wealthy societies organize economic life. Most importantly, they treat individual reproductive choices as if they bear sole responsibility for systemic emissions, ignoring the ways that policy, infrastructure, and corporate decisions shape individual footprints. The Kaya identity provides a more nuanced framework. Total emissions equal population times affluence times energy intensity times carbon intensity. Population matters, but so do the other variables. The top 10% of global emitters account for roughly half of all carbon emissions, while the bottom 50% account for only 10%. This suggests that consumption patterns and energy systems might matter more than raw population numbers. Though, of course, in high consumption societies, additional people do mean additional emissions under current arrangements. Meanwhile, demographic reality complicates the picture considerably. Global fertility rates are falling rapidly, and many countries are already below replacement level.
South Korea's fertility rate has dropped to 0.84 children per woman. Japan, Germany, and much of Eastern Europe face aging societies and potential labor shortages.
Governments are responding with increasingly aggressive pro-natalist policies. Hungary offers tax exemptions, subsidized loans, and car purchase grants for families with multiple children. Singapore provides substantial baby bonuses and extended parental leave. Similar programs operate across Europe, Asia, and increasingly in North America. The economic argument is straightforward. Aging societies struggle to support retirees, maintain infrastructure, and drive innovation without sufficient working-age populations. This demographic anxiety has spawned new movements and counter-movements. The birth strike phenomenon and related no kids because climate communities represent one pole. They're matched by pro-natalist revival movements, including niche tech-natalist communities in Silicon Valley that frame reproduction as essential to innovation and progress. Media narratives oscillate between demographic doom and baby bust, often with limited acknowledgement of the complex trade-offs involved. The long-termism movement, associated with philosophers like Nick Bostrom and William McCaskill, adds another dimension. If humanity's potential future includes trillions of people living flourishing lives across vast spans of time, then the expected value of ensuring that future might be enormous. This perspective challenges anti-natalist pessimism by suggesting that even small improvements in the probability of long-term human survival and flourishing could justify significant short-term costs, including the environmental impact of additional people. Critics worry that long-termist thinking neglects near-term justice and climate harm, potentially justifying present suffering for speculative future benefits. The debate reflects deeper disagreements about how to weigh certain present costs against uncertain future gains. Throughout these discussions runs the essential thread of reproductive justice, the principle that reproductive decisions must remain fundamentally autonomous and free from coercion. The history of population control provides sobering examples of what happens when moral arguments about reproduction become policy. Forced sterilizations in the United States targeted poor women and women of color. China's one-child policy created profound social distortions and human rights violations. India's 1970s sterilization campaigns, promoted with cash incentives and coercive tactics, remain a cautionary tale about population engineering. Any climate-informed reproductive ethics must avoid sliding into population control rhetoric with racist or classist undertones. The goal cannot be to reduce births among specific populations, but to ensure that whatever reproductive choices people make are genuinely informed and voluntary. This creates space for practical ethical pathways that respect autonomy while acknowledging climate realities. Harm reduction parenting might include choosing smaller families, prioritizing adoption or fostering, or committing to raise civically engaged children with lower environmental footprints. Place-based resilience offers another approach. Rather than avoiding parenthood entirely, some couples focus on building community support networks, securing climate-resilient housing, and developing heat adaptation strategies. The capabilities approach, developed by philosophers like Amartya Sen and William McCaskill, suggests that the ethical question isn't whether life involves risk, but whether we can reasonably secure basic human capabilities: health, education, political participation, social connection, for any child we choose to have. Timing and agency create additional considerations.
Some couples align their reproductive decisions with decarbonization trajectories, planning for later births after renewable energy transitions or securing material resilience. Others prioritize having children while they're biologically capable, then committing to climate action that benefits all future children. Biological constraints, fertility windows, age-related pregnancy risks mean that waiting for the climate to stabilize isn't a viable strategy for many prospective parents. But, perhaps most importantly, individual reproductive choices operate within structural contexts that often matter more than personal decisions. Rapid decarbonization of electricity grids, electrification of transport, urban design that reduces car dependence. These systemic changes can dramatically reduce the lifetime footprint of any individual child. Universal healthcare, childcare, clean air standards, and climate adaptation infrastructure reduce both the risks of parenthood and the moral weight of reproductive decisions. Immigration policy represents both a demographic and moral lever that often gets overlooked. Welcoming climate migrants can address aging demographics in wealthy countries while honoring justice for those displaced by environmental changes that they didn't cause. It suggests ways to maintain population stability without necessarily relying on increased births among current residents. The realistic synthesis that emerges is both humble and complex. It's reductive to blame individual births for systemic emissions, but it's also naive to treat reproduction as ethically neutral under escalating climate risk. The live ethical question becomes contextual. Under what conditions, personal, communal, structural, does saying yes to life become a defensible act of care rather than an imposition of harm? The answer depends not just on abstract moral reasoning, but on the concrete capabilities we can secure for future children and the structural changes we can make to reduce the risks they'll face. This suggests that climate-informed reproductive ethics can't be separated from climate-informed politics, policy, and community building.
We've traveled through ancient philosophy and modern psychology, traced demographic trends and emissions calculations, mapped movements and counter-movements. The threads converge into a recognition that transcends simple answers. The ethics of creating life under climate uncertainty isn't a problem to be solved, but a tension to be held with wisdom, compassion, and humility. The antinatalist perspective spotlights profound truths we cannot ignore. Existence always involves unconsented risk. Suffering is woven into the fabric of consciousness itself. Climate change amplifies both the scope and probability of future harm in ways that previous generations never had to contemplate. When we create life, we impose these realities on someone who had no voice in the decision. But the life-affirming perspective illuminates equally profound truths. Human agency remains real and powerful. People routinely transcend their circumstances and find meaning amid difficulty. The same species that created climate change also builds hospitals, writes symphonies, develops renewable energy, and expresses love across vast differences. The capacity for both harm and care, destruction and creation runs through every human life. Both perspectives expose something essential. Creating life is neither purely private nor purely public. Its ethics live at the intersection of personal values and collective responsibilities, intimate decisions, and planetary consequences. This suggests two practical tests for any reproductive decision, whether toward having children or choosing to remain child-free. The first is the compassion test. If this child were born,
Could you reasonably secure their basic capabilities, safety, health, dignity, community, amid climate uncertainty? This isn't about guaranteeing a perfect life, which is impossible under any circumstances. It's about ensuring access to healthcare, education, social connection, and the psychological resilience needed to navigate whatever future emerges. It requires honest assessment of your material resources, community support, and capacity for the demands of long-term caregiving. The second is the solidarity test. Will your choice be coupled with meaningful action for those who will live with the consequences? Whether you have children or remain child-free, the moral weight of the decision depends partly on whether you're also engaged in broader efforts, policy advocacy, mutual aid, decarbonization, climate resilience, that benefit all future people. Reproductive ethics cannot be separated from climate ethics more generally. These tests suggest a reframed imperative. Perhaps the fundamental task isn't to produce or refuse life, but to create conditions in which saying yes to life isn't naive and saying no isn't coerced by despair. This means rapid decarbonization, yes, but also strengthened social safety nets, climate adaptation infrastructure, and communities capable of supporting children regardless of the environmental challenges they face.
It means ensuring that reproductive choices remain genuinely voluntary, free from both pro-natalist pressure and anti-natalist guilt. It means recognizing that different people with different values, circumstances, and capabilities might reasonably reach different conclusions while acting from identical moral concern for future welfare. Most importantly, it means acknowledging that the world future children will inhabit depends fundamentally on choices we make now. Not just about reproduction, but about energy systems, economic structures, social norms, and political priorities. The climate crisis is not a fixed backdrop against which reproductive decisions happen. It's a dynamic challenge that human agency can still meaningfully address. Consider this thought experiment. Imagine receiving a letter from the year 2050. It begins, "I want to understand why you decided what you did about having children." The letter might come from a child you chose to have, or from a young adult in a world where you chose not to. It might come from a climate refugee, or from someone living in a successfully decarbonized society. It might come from someone who benefited from the resources you invested in collective solutions, or from someone who suffered because not enough people made such investments. Whatever your decision, children or child-free, the letter asks for an explanation you can defend not just to yourself, but to the future you helped create through all your choices, not just reproductive ones. What would you want to be able to say? In a world on fire, we all face the question of what kind of ancestor to be. Some will answer by adding lives with love and intentionality. Others will answer by adding room for all lives to thrive. Both can be expressions of the same underlying value, care for the future, that extends beyond the boundaries of our individual families, our immediate communities, our biological lifespans. The question that remains, the one that will outlast this video, outlast this moment, perhaps outlast us, is whether we can hold both truths simultaneously. Whether we can acknowledge the genuine moral weight of creating life under climate uncertainty while also honoring the human agency that makes different responses possible. The choice you make about reproduction is important, but it's not the only choice that matters. How you make it, with what values, in what community, with what commitment to the broader work of creating a habitable future, might matter even more.
In the end, we are all betting on some version of tomorrow. The question is what we're willing to stake on that bet and what we're willing to do to improve the odds for everyone.